Okay.
Just a quick heads up for you online people. I'll here hopefully in the next few minutes I'll get posted the thing for this weekend's lab trip for you to do your lab report and that kind of stuff, including instructions for the online alternative. So I've been a little bit late getting it, but I will get it up there the next little bit. That was all I had to say. So there you go.
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. I just have to make the plea again. Please get on there and sign up for whatever crop you want to do your project on. It's really a good way for us to share information with each other about the specific crops, since we don't have enough time to get to the specifics in the semester. So please get on and do that. It's at the bottom of the modules. I can move it if that would help. Also, for those of you that needed quizzes reopened, I do have those quizzes open to you. So just log on there and take the quiz. The quiz for Chapter 4 I neglected to publish. So it is up now and available, and you can expect the quiz for Chapter 5 to be available later today. So get those quizzes in, and we'll just have a review after that quiz is finished, that Chapter 5 quiz, kind of reviewing for the whole unit there, and address any questions, concerns you guys might have. Whenever we go through these quizzes, a lot of times I have some questions in there that I have to go in and manually grade. So just be aware that when you initially get your grade from those quizzes, that is not the final grade. So don't be, startled if it comes up and you've got like a 50 or something. It'll change. Anyway, let's get back into the soils. Chapter 5 here. As we were discussing, soils are extremely important. All right, so last chapter of the unit 1 here. I hope you guys are reading along with us in the book. So we left off talking about texture and looking at that table of what texture does. So one of the big things that soil texture does is influence the pore space, which influences the way that water drains, and those pockets in the soil, those larger pores, the macropores, are either filled with water or air. So something unbeknownst to many people, we all know that plants need carbon dioxide, right? And they produce oxygen, but did you know plants also need oxygen in the root zone? So we need that oxygen there for respiration for the roots themselves. Without the ability for the roots to respire, they can't actually take in water or nutrients. So we need soil air, that soil aeration. Also, a lot of the soil organisms, the beneficial bacteria and fungi, perform much better in soils that are more aerated, have more air in them. Texture also influences the ease of tillage. So when we're talking about cultivating the soil, plowing it, tilling it, disking it, it's influenced by the soil texture. As we mentioned, the sandier soils, loamier soils tend to be a lot more easy to till than clay soils. I will also add to that it is at the right soil moisture level, right? So if soils are really dry, it doesn't matter what the texture is, they're not going to be able to be tilled as well. They're not going to be as responsive to that. They're extremely wet, then really tilling any kind of soil tillage can destroy the soil structure. Also, most crops are going to grow better in the kind of Goldilocks, the loam soil, more so than sandy or clay soils. and that's due to all of those factors. But, I mean, again, we need a little bit of all of the textural components for a soil to do well. And in the lab, we'll get to see, what those textural components do. So soil structure is the actual arrangement of the particles, the textural component of the soil, into these secondary units. And the manner in which these particles are held together influences that secondary structure. That unit is referred to as an aggregate, and it's a clump of soil particles acting as an individual larger particle having specific characteristics. Usually that's seen as the size and the form of that aggregation, referring to the structure of the soil. And they can vary in size from a fraction of a centimeter to several centimeters in diameter. And they can be held together very strongly or very weakly. So here's just an image looking at the descriptive words and the images associated with what soil scientists use to describe soil structure. So we have a platy structure here in A. Platy structure is often seen in the subsoil in the B horizon or lower. And this is often what we see in terms of when we get hard pans in the soil. So you've probably heard that term before. A hard pan is just a section of soil that is resistant to moisture penetrating it, resistant to anything penetrating it. So if you've put up fencing or taken down fencing, you probably had to deal with hard pans at some point. Whenever you get through that, it's really difficult, one, to get a structure into it, get water into it. Also, it will hold onto it very strongly. So it'd be really difficult to get an old post out if it's crammed there into a platy structure like a hard pan. They're not always bad things though. I mean, lower down in soil, they can help to hold water. So platy structure is this flat, kind of large plane of this structure of soil, usually due to soil compaction. On B here, we've got prismatic soil structure. And prismatic soil structure and also C, columnar soil structure, they are a little bit more conducive to soil water draining, actually moving and actually percolating through the soil. So infiltrating and then moving along this kind of vertical structure that we have in the prismatic and columnar structures. And this is also kind of more often in the subsoil, but can also be seen extending into the topsoil and the A horizon as well. D and E are both blocky soil structures. And the blocky soil structures are somewhat similar to the prismatic and columnar in that they can allow moisture to travel in between these blocks, basically. So better than A, but still they're kind of cementing together into these large blocks, which prevents some root penetration. So D and E also more often in the subsoil. F is granular soil structure, and that's what we generally see in the A horizon in the topsoil due to the high levels of organic matter. This is where we're going to have the most root growth, the most biological activity in the soil. This is what we want our soil to look like after tillage. So granular soil is kind of what we're going for crop production. All right, let's look at the effects of climate on soil. So we talked about how the weathering of the rock itself, creates the soil and causes it to be developed into these layers. So how does climate affect that? And the rate at which that soil looks like or different than the parent material itself. So first, the soil chemical properties are determined largely by what we call colloid size. And a colloid is, just think of it as these soil particles sticking together. And that's usually through clay minerals, although it can also occur from humus as well. So the silicate and aluminosilicate minerals are more weathered, resulting in soils that we know as oxasols. And whenever we get to this ending of the word S-O-L-S there, sols, that is referring to the orders of soils. There are 12 orders of soils worldwide. Those that are more weathered are oxasols. In cold, humid regions where we have a lot of forest vegetation, especially in like the taiga, with these climatic factors of cool, wet weather, they produce what are known as the spodosols. We have organic compounds that are produced by decaying conifer needles that form these acid solutions. You think of pine needles, for instance, they have this kind of acidic part to them. So they actually are good to use for mulch of acid-loving plants like rhododendrons or blueberries. But in the soils, they form these acid solutions that help to dissolve iron and aluminum oxides in the basic compounds. That causes these ions to form and then leach into lower depths in the soil. This produces a little layer in between, often the A and B horizons, known as the E horizon. Just this other horizon that we didn't mention earlier, but it's usually kind of a much lighter color, usually almost white. We call it E because it is the layer of eluviation. And eluviation is just that process of those ions moving down. So climate can also affect the pH, or the soil's acidity or alkalinity. And pH literally means the power of hydrogen. Hydrogen ions, and what we're looking at here is the positively charged hydrogen ions, a cation, and its activity in the soil solution. So if you were actually to compute pH, the power of hydrogen, then it is the negative logarithm of the number of hydrogen ions in a soil solution. That's actually how they get pH, but what we generally think of as pH is how acidic or basic a soil is. Basic being a synonym there for alkaline. So on the pH scale, it goes from 0 to 14. And on either end of the scale, we have the extremes. Generally, soils, though, are not in the extremes. And that's because, I mean, if we have the extremes on either end, it gets to the point where, organisms cannot survive in it, except for very few specialized bacteria and fungi that can thrive in those conditions. Very few organisms, though, survive there. So most soils are in a range from 4.5 to about 9.5 in pH. The very acidic soils being more around that 4.5. Generally, in terms of climate, these soils occur more in the humid regions. If you think about it, the more moisture we have in the soil, the more rainfall, the more precipitation, the more acidic a soil tends to be naturally. The reason for that is that H2O, right? Rainwater is H2O, and there's H in that, right? So there's 2 molecules of hydrogen. So the higher the hydrogen, the more acidic the substance is. So that's why rainwater tends to be, more acidic, and why soils from humid regions tend to be more acidic. So in this range, now we do have some plants that like that, right? I mean, there are acid-loving plants like rhododendrons and blueberries, things that grow in these areas where we have these naturally acidic soils. Generally, we get the more alkaline, the more basic soils in arid regions, but rarely does that go above like a 9.5. So the closer we get to 0, the more acidic it is. The closer we get to 14, the more alkaline or basic it is. And 7 is the neutral mark. And generally, the soils that we want are hovering right around neutral. We call that the sweet soil. If you've heard that term before, sweet soil is that soil that hovers right around neutral in pH. Most plants do not grow well in highly acidic or highly alkaline soils, but as we can see here, we do have some pH range for the optimum growth of some cultivated plants on either end. Notice though that on the alkaline end, it doesn't really go much higher than neutral. We're looking at like 7.5. We have like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower on that end. The brassicas, they tend to like that alkaline soil a little bit more than most other crops. Most of them though are closer to neutral. We have some that prefer a slightly acidic soil. We have some plants that grow well in either of these, but the acidity, in this case, like the potato, if we look at where potato is on here, it doesn't necessarily mean that the potato grows better in acidic soil. It just means that the acidic soil tends to detract from potato pests. So check that out. Another interesting thing on this table, looking at the hydrangea. And you might have heard this before. Hydrangeas can actually change color depending on what the soil acidity is. So if hydrangeas are grown in acidic soil, they tend to be blue. And basic soil, they tend to be more pink. Fascinating. This table or chart here is just looking at why we want the kind of sweet soil, that neutral soil. So if we look at 7, we have the widest range, the greatest availability of all of these different nutrients for plants. Some of them are more available on the acidic side or more available on the alkaline side, but we have the greatest range, the most available nutrients right there hovering around neutral, 6.5 to 7.5. As we mentioned, soils in the climates with high rainfall tend to be more acidic. Arid climates tend to be more alkaline. The alkalinity, it's also a chemical thing too. So because those salts tend to accumulate in drier soils, that helps to make them more alkaline. Naturally, we don't have sudden large changes in soil pH. Naturally, the change is very gradual. But we can influence it. We can make it quicker by the addition of particular minerals and elemental compounds. And however, that change does still tend to be gradual. So ideally, if we're going to make alterations in the soil for our growing season, we want to test the soil ideally the season before. So we should be testing soil now if we want to make changes to the pH for the spring. So anyway, this kind of change of pH in soil we're looking at as the term of buffering. And buffering is how a soil naturally is able to resist it. The more finer textured soils, the more heavy clay in a soil, the more resistant it is to buffering. All right, another very important property for soil is cation exchange capacity. And this is a chemical property, but we tend to have higher cation exchange capacity in clay and organic soils, where we have these colloids created with clay and humus. So cation exchange capacity is just the ability for anything, but in this case, soil particles, to attract and hold on to cations. What's a cation? A cation is just a positively charged ion. So clay and humus or humic colloids are able to carry these negative charges on the surface of the colloids themselves, which means they are able to attract and hold on to the cations themselves. So the clay particle or the humic particle, those colloids are similar to what we refer to as anions. An anion is just a negatively charged ion. And in many cases, they have these kind of anion sites where they might have negatively charged ions on them. But these negatively charges are attracting the positive charges. Opposites attract, right? So the higher the clay content, the higher the humic content, the higher the cation exchange capacity, the ability for it to hold on to these nutrients. That doesn't necessarily mean that clay soils are good, though, right? I mean, it can hold on to it, but the stronger that charge is, the negative charge, the stronger it holds on to it. So it might not be able to give it away to the soil solution. The water moving through the soil, it actually picks up these nutrients and then allows them to be absorbed by plants. So when they're held loosely, they can be replaced or exchanged with soil water or the soil solution. They're not all attracted or held with equal energy. Most plant nutrients are cations and can be held by the soil particles, except a few. Nitrate is a good example. Nitrate is actually the most available form of nitrogen, but it occurs as an anion. So we have to have both the cation exchange capacity and anion exchange capacity too. Because of this principle, nitrate is easily leached out of the root zone, very mobile. Cation exchange capacity tends to be greater under alkaline conditions than acidic conditions. It's best right around neutral. The acidity basically doesn't allow the nutrients to, they're more strongly bonded so they're not able to be moved and exchanged. Plants can't get them. So a lot of the plants that have, adapted to acidic soils have adapted to use less soil nutrients. In the saline soils, the salty soils, right, they contain large quantities of these soluble salts. This is mostly in the alkaline soils that we have this. And typically they are holding on to things like chlorides and sulfates of calcium, magnesium, and sodium, which are very important nutrients. But when they accumulate at high levels, they become somewhat unavailable and also inhibit the uptake of other nutrients. So notice the pH range here. We're looking at a higher range for the saline and saline sodic soils. Talking about soil organisms and just the biology in the soil. We mentioned that soils can have millions, if not billions, of microorganisms in the soil, and that it's all kinds of different forms of life. The types and the amount of those organisms that are actually present in the soil depends on the climate, the vegetation, the pH, the fertility level, the temperature, and the moisture. So all of these different factors play a role in what is living in the soil. And there's this whole underground soil food web taking place, a whole ecology that is occurring, interacting with the plant roots, allowing nutrients to be more available in the case of mycorrhiza, or in this case, what we have pictured here, the rhizobium bacteria. If you remember from chapter 2, that mutualistic relationship, symbiosis, these nodules in these roots contain this rhizobium bacteria that are able to pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere, out of the air, and put them into the soil, put them into the plants. There are also bacteria that do it for sulfur as well. So it's essential process to some plants. We see this a lot in the legumes. So the legume family being the nitrogen fixers. We talked about that when we were talking about plants and humans, right? The legumes are fixing nitrogen. They tend to have greater levels of particular amino acids as a result. The grains lack it. And agroecologically, if we think about it, they also have this relationship where the legumes provide a little bit of extra nitrogen. The grains, they tend to actually feed off of that extra nitrogen. They need it. So it's an interesting relationship there. It's a dynamic relationship. Not all soil organisms are beneficial, though. Some of the most, detrimental pests are actually living in the soil, especially the nematodes. And they attack and destroy a wide range of species by feeding on the roots of the plants themselves. Phylloxera is a species of aphid that attacks grape roots, which can devastate vineyards, and did devastate vineyards until resistant rootstock cultivars were developed to that particular type of aphid. They live underground, feeding on the roots. We also have pathogenic soil-borne bacteria and fungi that can be responsible for significant crop losses. We have other insects living in the soil that are feeding on roots too. Grubs, especially, the larval stage of a lot of different types of insects. Soil organic matter, the OM content, has a profound effect on many aspects of the soil, but especially the soil biology, because it's providing food and energy for the soil organisms. We call it organic matter, not because it's based on certified organic, OMRI listed compounds, but because it is made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. If any of you have had any organic chemistry out there, that's what you're looking at, right? Organic referring to life. Life forms are all, the bulk of us are made up of these hydrocarbons, chains of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It just so happens that those chains of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, those hydrocarbons, are also what makes up fossil fuels, right? Which were once living things over the millennia and over millions of years, really turned into oil and natural gas and coal. So we have to think about organic matter. Again, it's in flux. It changes not just from soil type to soil type, but throughout time, because it decomposes. The speed of which that organic matter does decompose varies according to its chemical composition. For the simple carbohydrates, it's very quickly decomposed and made available to organisms in the soil. For things like fats and lignans and the complex carbohydrates, it's much slower. After complete decomposition occurs, organic matter becomes this complex colloidal substance known as humus. Not hummus, right? You don't want to dip your chip in that. But you do want to dip your roots in it, right? So humus is this kind of stable but somewhat amorphous colloidal substance that is organic matter when it's taken to the limit, when it's resistant to further decomposition. So if we can increase the humus level of the soil over time, then we can increase the long-term amounts of organic matter. Generally, though, we cannot long-term increase organic matter. And in most cases, we're looking at it topping out in the range of 5 to 10%, usually closer to the 5% level. So what does it do? Humus and organic matter together, it helps improve the soil structure. It's the best thing that you can add to clay soils, basically, to improve soil structure and change it from like the platy or blocky soil types to more the granular soil types. It also increases water holding and cation exchange abilities. So whenever we're looking at soil tests, we're looking at, say, the organic matter percentage in a soil. We need to compare that also to a textural test to see what percentage of it is clay. Clay and humus work together to create the colloids of the soil that are most responsible for holding on to available water and available cation exchange. So that's why it's important to add these components to the soil. Amend the soil by adding especially organic matter, forms of organic matter. If we just add fertilizer, we're not really improving the soil structure. And over time, we're actually negatively affecting the soil structure. So the best way to improve it is to add organic matter and contribute to that humic principle. All right, the carbon to nitrogen ratio is also a very important part that helps aid in that decomposition and the availability of some nutrients, in particular nitrogen, right? Plants need both carbon and nitrogen, and there is a close relationship between carbon and nitrogen, the C to the N in the soil. That ratio in natural soils is nearly constant at about 12 parts of carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Whenever we add carbon or nitrogen to the soil, we're altering that ratio. We do have variations throughout seasons, especially correlating with the climate, especially with temperature and rainfall. So that ratio tends to be lower in arid regions and warmer regions than in humid and cooler regions. And this carbon to nitrogen ratio is what affects the organic material in the soil. If we have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, the nitrogen tends to be tied up in the organisms that are causing decomposition. So the higher the carbon, the lower the nitrogen. The lower the carbon, the higher the nitrogen, ideally, right? So it starts at that 12 to 1, or even if we're composting, right? If we're actually trying to create our own source of organic matter and finished compost as close as we can get to making humus, we want a high carbon to nitrogen ratio to cause that decomposition. We're looking at 20 up to 25 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen to affect that in a way that accelerates the decomposition, that allows it to turn more into the finished product that becomes an excellent addition to soil. Compost generally is one of the best things that we can add to soil because we're adding almost stable organic matter to the soil. When we have lots of available nitrogen in the soil, we have an increase in the activity of organisms consuming that nitrogen, which causes it to be decreased. And then we have an increase in that nitrogen over time as those organisms are basically dying off and releasing that nitrogen. So that carbon nitrogen ratio is somewhat in flux, especially as we add the organic matter. Now let's just talk a little bit here about soil degradation. Soil properties are changing constantly with how we are interacting with the soil. but the characteristics are usually, maintained throughout time with slow changes in the natural environment. So what happens to soils as they are degraded? Generally, all upland soils are going to experience some erosion, some movement of soil particles down slope. But we can minimize that severity by vegetative cover. So again, going back to this image, we're seeing that erosion. At the bottom of the slope, it tends to slow down a little bit, although it still can be picked up by wind. Over here on the right side of that picture, you do see some erosion taking place, especially kind of right on the edge of bare soil to cover soil. But the covered soil is much more likely to hold on to the soil particles. So covering soil is extremely important. Bare soil is easily eroded. If you've noticed, looking around, in our region especially, now if you go into drier regions, you don't see it as much, but almost all soil is naturally covered with something. You go into the forest, it's covered with leaf litter. It's covered with, sticks and twigs and chunks of wood. You go into grasslands, it's all covered with vegetation. Nature abhors, bare soil, and it will try to cover it. So when we till our fields, to try to get better tillage, ideally we want to cover it as quickly as possible. Because if we don't cover it, nature will cover it with weeds, right? So that's why when we're talking about the ecology, why cover cropping is such a good, it's like an ecological technique, really. It's a way of keeping that soil covered, keeping the soil in place, and allowing it to go through the natural property changes that enhance the soil rather than degrade it. Whenever that cover is removed by fire, flood, or exposed, we have accelerated erosion. Faster than new soil can form, reducing the depth of our productive topsoil. Sorry, I just kind of accidentally skipped ahead there. So if erosion continues unabated, it eventually, our rich A horizon, our topsoil, can eventually be lost, forcing plants to root in the less desirable B horizon, which again, we tend to have that structure of the blocky soil or the platy soil structures in those B horizons, which are just less conducive to root penetration. They're more often more clay soils. Try to be a root grown in clay, right? All right, so that concludes our beginning discussion on soil. Does anybody have any questions or concerns based on what we discussed today and on Monday? All right, well, if you don't, later today, I'm going to be posting a lab for us to do at home. And this is part of a soil test, basically. And I would actually like for you all to, if you wish to, do some soil testing. Actually make a soil sample. You can get soil sample boxes from your local extension agents. Actually, I'll just show you one here. I've got some ready for students in my soils class. It'll look something like this. And there's a form associated with it. So we'll send our samples off to Virginia Tech Soil Testing Laboratory. And there's a form online. I'll post this on Canvas. That's going to be an optional part, actually sending off a soil test. But we want to take a large soil sample, have everybody take a large soil sample so we can do some soil testing on it ourselves. And one of them, I'll show you here in just a second. Let me get some light on this so you can see it a little bit better. We're going to do a jar test. And the jar test, basically what it's doing is looking at the soil texture. If I can find a good one here. So what are the textural components of a soil? Whenever you all are getting soil samples, I would recommend getting, a large bag of soil. And I don't know how well you all can see this, but this is fairly granular soil. We want it to be free of like rocks, roots, stems, stuff like that. So you don't necessarily have to go out and screen it and sift it, but just try to get any of the large chunks out of there so it's easier to test it. And we're going to be doing this jar test. So you can see in this jar, basically, and what you'll need is at least one mason jar. I recommend the wider mouth. You'll need a soil sample. If you guys can see this on your screen there, what we're looking at is we're going to add a little bit of borax to your soil sample, and we're going to fill it up with water. We're going to shake it up a bunch, and then it's going to precipitate into these different layers. And let me try to get that closer to you. Sorry, the lighting's not great in here, but if you can tell, there are 3 layers here that it's kind of settled out into. And because sand is the largest particle, it settles first. Silt being the second size particle, settles second. And then at the very top, we get the clay settling out because it's the smallest, finest particle. It takes the longest for it to precipitate out. So we're going to do this jar test to see what our soil texture is. Because when you send off this soil sample here in the box to Virginia Tech's laboratory, they're going to look mostly at your nutrient analysis. Now, you can check the box there for organic matter to get that as well, but it doesn't tell you anything about the levels of sand, silt, and clay in your soil. So it's good to do this test as well, to see what your textural components are, to see how your soil might actually act. All right, sorry. Actually, that lighting might even be better there. Let me just pull that up again to see if you guys can see those layers in this. You might also notice that there's some stuff here floating at the top. That can give you an idea of what percentage of organic matter actually is in your soil. It's not going to give you a surefire percentage, but the more stuff you have floating around in it, the higher organic matter content you have. So that test is going to be part of it. I'm going to give you guys actually a couple of weeks to do the lab. I'll have a little part on there that is also looking at, how do you read a soil test, basically. And if y'all want to, if you get the soil test, you want me to help you analyze them, I'm happy to do that for you. The other thing I want you to do, and let me get back to my screen share here, is go through the soil web survey process. And so if you just go to Google or whatever your favorite search engine is and type in soil web survey, turn the screen back on for you, Hunter. It should come up as the first hit there. And basically what this is it's done through the NRCS branch of the USDA. NRCS is the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And basically what they've done is they sent soil scientists around the country examining soils. And they also take the information that is sent into soil testing laboratories in each state. They compile that information to create these soil maps. So open up this web soil survey. You click on this green button here. It says Start Web Soil Survey. And what we have to do here first, it defaults to this Area of Interest tab. So we actually have to get our area of interest defined before we can look at what soil types we have. So there's a few different ways to do this. You could actually scroll through the map itself. I think probably the easiest way is just to type in an address. So I'm just going to type us in here, 100 VHCC Drive. That's where we are at Virginia Highlands Community College. It takes us to VHCC. And then what we need to do is click on these buttons up here. They are, let's see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Yeah, okay, so they are used to define our area of interest. If you have odd shaped land like most of us have, we want to look at this one, define your area of interest by polygon. So I'm going to click on that. It's going to give you a little crosshair symbol. Put that on the map, click on it, and just try to go around your area to define that. When you finish, just double click. That creates your area of interest. See, it says here 133.5 acres. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to click on this soil map tab. And the soil map shares with us, the different soil types. It gives us these map unit names over here. These are the actual soil series that we have on our campus. So first, list those, and then we'll actually play around with the Soil Data Explorer. From this, you can actually download soil data. You can, if you want them to print it out and send it to you, you can actually buy some things from it. So let's just take a look at the Soil Data Explorer here, Data Explorer, however you want to say it. There are different things that we can look at. For instance, we can look at recreational development, construction materials, waste and water management, vegetative productivity. So we can look at, let's just say, yields of non-irrigated crops. Oh, can't run that. Yields of non-irrigated crops by component. So let's just say that we want to do, let's say we want to grow tobacco. We can actually click on view rating here, and it gives us a percentage and a rating of how much tobacco we could produce in pounds on each particular soil type. So it's pretty useful, really, and I just want you guys to play around with that. You can also go up here to this tab, Soil Properties and Qualities, and we can look at soil chemical properties. For instance, let's look at that cation exchange capacity. If we click on that tab, it gives us, it's going to ask us to define the depth. So let's just say that we're looking at what the cation exchange capacity is going to be for an annual crop that we're growing. So we're looking at the top depth of being, let's just say 1 inch, the bottom depth being 8 inches. Change that to inches. And then we'll view the rating. And then it's going to tell us what our cation exchange capacity is for these different soil types. So, for instance, 8.4 millet equivalents per 100 grams, or 9.0. In general, the greater the cation exchange capacity, the more cations that are available. We could also look at the effective cation exchange capacity, the electrical conductivity. It can even guess what your pH is, too. So, lots of different things that this tool can do. I want you guys to kind of go through this in the lab to just play around with this tool. It's good for figuring out what your land could be productive for, what your soils are productive for. All right, so I'll post that later this afternoon and give you guys about 2 weeks to do that lab. Again, feel free to shoot me any questions, comments, or concerns. On that note, it's past our time together, so I'll go ahead and sign off. Y'all have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you next week.
Okay.